Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you may be watching this. I'm Jamie Molt, and this is the Grad Connection. Now, I realize it's been probably several weeks since I've posted video with the holidays and everything else going on. I took a break, and so hopefully you've had an opportunity for a break as well. I've been going through this research series, and I think one of the things I probably said early on, but I just wanted to provide a kind of a reminder is, I'm presenting these topics on research, particularly research proposals, in a particular direction or a particular way, because at least when I used to teach a course on this topic, it seemed that this approach to developing the research proposal, starting with the research question and using it as the driver for everything and so on and so forth, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute, but seemed to really help students clarify in their mind and develop what I would see as the first three chapters of a traditional monolithic kind of dissertation. Today I want to talk about scope and significance, which is typically in the monolithic dissertation. It's usually part of chapter one, but as you develop or write grant proposals, also the scope and significance section is usually a pretty big part of that as well. But as I said, it's like when you're developing a research proposal, when you're starting down the path of developing a thesis or a dissertation particularly, the research question becomes the driver for everything. And that research question can come about in one of two ways. And it kind of goes back to something I said in one of the early videos where faculty that mentor graduate students usually take one of two primary approaches as it relates to the research that their graduate students do. Either one, they say, this is the research question you will do, so they provide you the specific question, and the reason for that is typically because they've been funded to do some specific research, and that's what needs to happen. The other approach is where they ask you what you want to research, where it's pretty much on you to come up with the research question. So the approach in these two ways, and I suppose there's some middle ground in that, a faculty member may provide you a topical area and a list of questions that you could pick from, that kind of thing. Nevertheless, these two approaches to working with graduate students are really what determines whether you start with the research question and everything drives from it, or the other approach where you're trying to find a topic, you may actually have to do the literature review first to figure out what has not been answered yet or what would make a good question. So sometimes, like if you're working with faculty who are dictating the question, it's really the literature review is probably going to happen after the research question. If you're working on where you're actually trying to figure out what the question is, where it's kind of on you to elicit what the question is that you need to ask, then you're going to do a literature review first. And again, the literature review can vary these two types, right? So if the question is dictated to you, oftentimes the literature review may be limited. And what I mean by that is it really all you need to do is focus on finding the most poignant articles that are going to help you build the legal case for why that question is valid. If it's this type of question where you have to come up with a question, you actually have to do a much broader literature review, a more comprehensive review. In other words, not just the things that support the research question, but even figuring out the context and the lay of the land so you even know what question to ask. The literature review in both situations becomes the legal case for why you're asking the question you're asking, as well as how you're approaching the research. So the literature review is a legal case for the question and the methodology. And sometimes but sometimes you'll end up, like particularly if you're doing the research where you're having to come up with the question, it may be much broader than that because you have to provide all this background and it's kind of proving grounds for yourself to and for your faculty member the committee to show that you really know all of the seminal research or seminal articles that have to do with that topic. So before I talk about scope and significance is wrapped in this conversation. As I said, I'm presenting this. I would say if you're doing quantitative research, where you're trying to test an existing theory, the process is typically going to be research question. Literature review may be on one side or the other of that, but you develop the research question, you develop the hypotheses, you develop the variables, and these are all things that we've talked about thus far. And in that process, somewhere in that process, you're going to be defining scope and significance, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. If you're doing qualitative research, in other words, you're generating theory rather than testing it, you have a research question, really guiding questions, quite honestly. Those guiding questions tell you what kind of methodology you want to use. biography, ethnography, grounded theory, case study. There's all kinds of methods. And then on top of that, in qualitative research, you oftentimes talk about also a lens that you might view that, be viewing things through. You may have a feminist view, you may have a particular ethnic view, you may have all these different kind of lenses or glasses that you could put on as you're looking at or generating that theory. But nevertheless, in both of these scenarios, at some point, usually before you get to real deep into the methodology, and it's usually after you've done your literature review, this is where you're going to actually start providing the context for the research question via scope and significance. Essentially, the scope section and the significance section are usually part of chapter 1 in a monolithic dissertation. Just as a reminder, what I mean by a monolithic dissertation is chapter 1 is an introduction, chapter 2 is a literature review, chapter 3 is a methodology, and in a proposal for a thesis or a dissertation, usually the proposal are those 3 chapters. Now, if you're doing the article-based dissertation, and I'm kind of summarizing a lot of the videos that I've already talked about thus far, but if you're doing an article-based dissertation, you're going to have scope and significance sections, but it's going to be part of each article, right? Because they're basically a microcosm of the overall work, as opposed to, and then really that's the difference between the 2 types of, well, one of the differences. So scope, what you're doing, the scope section and the significance section in a monolithic dissertation is typically a page, page and a half. It's not, a long expository. You try to be succinct, but the scope section, you're basically starting to establish boundaries loosely around the topic that you're going to be focusing on. So you have your research question, and essentially this is where you actually start to provide context. So what I typically try to do when I've worked with graduate students in developing research questions before is, there's this balance. When I talked about research questions, I said, I'll give you some suggestions about, suggestions for research questions. One, it needs to be able to roll off your tongue. You have to have this balance between specificity and generality, right? And my experience has been is usually students who are developing research questions are usually too generic or too general, and they need to narrow or focus. And the problem, though, is as you start to focus, the research question starts getting longer and it can become more complex. And so there's a balance between having a brief research question that's to the point and then providing additional context through the scope section. So things that you can't say in the research question, details, if you will, you can define in the significance section, or the scope section. And then what I would say is, additionally, usually these types of dissertations also have a section called assumptions, limitations, delimitations. That's where you get into kind of like that's where you get into very specific statements, and probably the next video that I do, I'll talk about assumptions, limitations, delimitations. So essentially you have a research question that's semi-pointed, if you will, a scope section which starts to generally put boundaries around what it is that you're focusing on, and then you have assumptions, limitations, delimitations, which are very specific statements. It's kind of like I oftentimes I use a description of your research question would be the title of the contract. The generality, the general statements would be the body of the contract. And then the assumptions, limitations, delimitations are the specific fine print in the contract. So there are lots of different analogies, but that's one that I oftentimes use is kind of relating this kind of how a contract works. So a scope section puts general boundaries. The other part, significance section, this is where you outline the importance to the world of what you're doing, or the importance to your world, right? And so I describe it that way because sometimes people will relate the significance of what they're doing to trying to solve some grand challenge, curing cancer, creating better purified water, creating better food sources, blah, 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 like tying it to huge problems that the world are facing. There are other times where the research that you're doing may actually just be related to your world. It may be related just to your specific discipline. And I've even worked with graduate students in some cases where it's really about them doing something new or taking a foray into a new field, right? And so it's about their world specifically as an individual. However you want to look at it, what you're trying to do is provide the significance. In other words, the way I oftentimes describe it is, why should anybody care about what you're doing? tell me? That's what the significance section is about, because most of the rest of your research proposal is going to be nitty gritty, stuff that people in your field would understand, but the general world may not know what you're talking about. And so the significance section is where you tell the general reader, essentially, why should anybody care what you're doing? What does it matter? And so that's what the significance section tries to answer. Now, one of the things I did want to talk about is oftentimes in grant proposals, you have what's called a broader, at least in an NSF, this is the term that they use, and I think it's probably typical in other grants, and maybe have different words for it, but you oftentimes will have to provide a broader impacts statement, and that's typically an amalgam of the scope and the significance, in my mind anyway. Other researchers may describe it a little bit differently. And that's so when you eventually get to writing grants, if you're a researcher and you eventually get to writing grants, this becomes a practical skill of being able to write a scope and significance section, because that's typically going to be premier in the grant. And when you write grant proposals, right? So it's like I'm taking you through this process of how you would develop a research proposal for a thesis or a dissertation, and I'm trying to give you the order, at least in my logic, of how you would write each of the pieces. Another significant piece that I oftentimes get confused is people when they start writing their thesis or dissertation, they get, not very far into it, and suddenly they write the abstract. Well, the abstract should be the absolute last thing you write after you're all done with the research, because it makes no sense to do so beforehand. I would say when you're writing a research grant, you would typically write the body of the grant and then come back and write the scope, the broader impact section, kind of towards the end, once you've kind of got everything gelled and you know where everything's going. So the scope and significance section, again, they become part of chapter 1 in the monolithic dissertation. And then that leads to kind of the next step, which is the development of the assumptions, the limitations, and the delimitations, which in some institutions, that's like one section. In other institutions, like at Purdue, the way I've typically seen it is each of those is a separate section. So the next video, I'm going to talk more about, what are assumptions, what are limitations, what are delimitations. I'll probably give my preferred view of how I like them to be written, specifically. And what I mean by that is I like specific bulleted statements, right, as opposed to a narrative, right? But we'll get into that next week. So hopefully you find this, hopefully you're finding these series useful. I do appreciate the comments that various people have said along the way. I am going to continue. I'm at least going to finish out the research series before I make a determination of whether I continue the grad connection or not. If you'd like to see this continue and you're actually watching these videos, I would encourage you to comment and let me know, because I'm wrestling with whether I continue to devote time to do this, because I haven't seen the numbers of people that I thought might view this content or find it useful, which is fine. I don't see it as a failure. This was just an experiment from the start, and I've been doing it for about a year now, I suppose. So I'm kind of making a determination whether I'm going to continue with this channel, as it were, or if I'm going to try to do something else. But nevertheless, I am going to finish the research series, and just so you kind of know where I'm going. So I said assumptions, limitations, and delimitations. I do want to do a video on literature review. I want to do a video on methodology in a generic way. Talk a little bit about quantitative approaches, qualitative approaches. I may do a video on what I would call bench, field, or other kinds of research approaches, because most of my experiences as it relates to like controlled environment kinds of things, as opposed to in the field kinds of things. Dealing with copyrights, I think, would be an important one. Maybe talk a little bit about data management. Talk about summary, conclusions, recommendations, which is kind of like the last chapter. And then some issues specific to articles. So I've got, 5 to 10 topics yet to talk about. So I'll be continuing these videos for at least to complete the research series. But if you've got some ideas or things you'd like to hear otherwise, I'm all ears. And we'll just see how this goes as we enter into this new year. So hope you have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.